Hello, my name is Shara McGlothan. I'm a student at Friends University, and today I'm going to do a training on internal family systems therapy, or you may hear it as IFS for short. So some assumptions around IFS is that people do have an innate drive toward and wisdom about their own health. Some people do have chronic problems because of their inner resources and wisdom are not able to be fully accessed. And so it causes constraints and imbalances and burdens based on the constraints that are being experienced. And then the last one is that we all have a self. This is not something that's developed over time or goes through stages. It's something that we always have, and then it cannot be damaged. It usually just gets pushed back based on burdens or parts that come up. So some concepts within IFS is first we have multiplicity. So this is subpersonalities of different ages, temperaments, talents, and desires that are referred to as parts. There can be different parts that we all have that are either categorized as exiles, managers, or firefighters. And so even though some of these parts are pushed into extreme roles, all our parts are considered valuable. So next we have polarization. So these are going to be parts that are in competition with each other. And so they're going to become more extreme so that they can counter or defeat other parts. Next, we have burdens. So these are going to be extreme ideas, behaviors, thoughts, emotions, or energies or feelings. And so we can have legacy burdens or personal burdens. So legacy burdens are usually going to be inherited from our family or ethnic group and even our culture. Then we have our personal burdens, which are going to be more so direct life events. So when you have legacy burdens, it's more so going to be things like maybe racism and things to that extent. But then if you have a personal burden, it's more so going to be maybe if you were like bullied in school. And so that would be something that's more personal and something that you experience more directly. So then we have blending, and this is when the self is going to become overwhelmed by parts. And so they're going to start blending together and pretty much fighting over who has the leadership of the system. So here is the movie Inside Out. If you all have ever seen it, this is pretty much a good example of IFS, and I'll go ahead and show a short clip of that.
Here we go. All right, open.
This looks new.
Think it's safe?
What is it?
Okay, caution. There is a dangerous smell, people. Hold on, what is that?
This is disgust. She basically keeps Riley from being poisoned, physically and socially.
That is not brightly colored or shaped like a dinosaur. Hold on, guys. It's broccoli! Well, I just saved our lives. Yeah, you're welcome.
Riley, if you don't eat your dinner, you're not going to get any dessert.
Wait, did he just say we couldn't have dessert?
That's anger. He cares very deeply about things being fair.
So that's how you want to play it, old man? No dessert? Oh, sure. We'll eat our dinner right after you eat this.
Right. Here comes an airplane.
Oh, airplane. We got an airplane, everybody.
So that was just an example of kind of how our parts are actually working within us. And as we have those parts, they're interacting with our external systems and their parts as well. Go ahead and stop that. Sorry about that. Had a feeling it was going to keep playing. So next we have our exiles. So these are going to be parts within us that fear and hide from emotional pain. They're usually going to be frozen in the past, and so they're going to be protected by our manager parts. They have experiences where they've been exploited, rejected, or abandoned by external systems. And this is usually based on the parts within them from their own abandonment and rejection that they've experienced in their own life. And so they're going to be subjected to negative judgments from other parts as well for being more vulnerable parts. And really all they want is just to be rescued and maybe have some redemption to show that they're valuable within the system as well. So examples of how exiles will show up is usually through emotional pains, traumas, fear, shame, or injury that has occurred. And it doesn't always have to be some big T trauma. It can be little T traumas as well. Us being, yelled at by an adult when they're feeling impatient. Or even it can show up of just maybe some neglect that you're not getting, maybe some attention from a parent. And so these exiles show up and they get frozen in that moment and not able to kind of function healthy in the system. So next we have managers. And so managers feel a fear that the exiles will escape and therefore not be good for the system. And so the managers will show up to sacrifice for the system to protect themselves and the system through varying strategies to avoid triggering the exiles. And so this is usually going to show up through controlling, criticizing, staying busy, being passive. But it'll also be some of those things that one experiences as an exile, what they're experiencing from that external system. So when a parent is being impatient or yelling, that parent is really operating out of their own managers. And then we have our firefighter parts, which is basically summoned when exiles have been activated. And so managers haven't been doing their jobs, or it just hasn't been sufficient to keep the exiles inactive. And so the firefighters come up. There's usually a hierarchy of activities, whereas managers, they'll kind of just do whatever works at that time. So if it's yelling or screaming, criticizing, defending, judging. Firefighters, on the other hand, kind of have, like I said, the hierarchy. So they'll try one thing, and then if that doesn't work, they'll move on to the next thing until they can kind of calm the system down. And this is usually done through numbing activities such as self-harm, binge eating, substance use, disassociation, and sexual risk taking. And then we have the self, and this is kind of the ultimate goal of IFS, is to have our clients operating out of their true self, which is their core. And so this is really supposed to be the inner leader that's embodying balance and harmony, and really guiding the other parts. The parts don't go away once we access ourselves, but they can just move out of the extreme roles that they have. So the self is whole. It's not something that is built upon or goes through the stages. It's just already fully functional. And so how do we know if we are operating from self or if we're operating from a part? And so a good way to recognize that is through the 8 C's. So there's clarity, compassion, courage, confidence, curiosity, creativity, calmness, and connectedness. And so we really want to be able to look at how much access do we have to these 8 things, and that kind of reveals some information of how much access we have to self. So the goals of IFS is to free parts from their extreme roles so that they can move into more preferred roles that would still be useful for the system. And then we also want to restore their trust of parts, restore the trust of parts in self. And so a lot of these parts are formed from childhood. And so these parts still look at the self as being this young child that doesn't have resources that we may have as adults. And so they're still treating the self as if they're just a young child. And then lastly, reharmonize the system of parts for collaboration so that the parts can still be in, useful roles and working with each other and with the self to keep the system healthy and in harmony. So the role of the therapist. So some do's is, as a therapist, we want to validate and explore the client's system and really get to know the parts and show respect and compassion and curiosity towards the parts and the roles that they have. We want to be supportive and accepting of these roles and these parts, even though that they are extreme. We know that they're in those extreme roles to protect and to help the system, and we want to really acknowledge that. And then we also want to collaborate and join with the client. The client is still the expert on themselves. And so we really just want to act as a guide and direct them into getting to know their parts and accessing self. So some don'ts for the therapist would be really steering clear of offering interpretations, reframes, and directives. We really want the parts to be able to speak and show up how they want to show themselves. And so we don't really want to fill in those gaps or anything. And then we want to make sure that we're not venturing beyond any time constraints or session limits that we may have. And so when we're doing IFS within session, we always want to be mindful of how much time we have left in the session so that we're not kind of opening up these spheres of the parts and then not able to kind of soothe them before we send them out the door. At the same time, if we only have a small number of sessions with the client, we want to be careful about exploring parts as well, that we're not accessing parts that we're not able to still support in the long term. And so you're really not going to go beyond really just befriending that part if you know that you're not going to have a lot of time to work with them. And the next, you don't want to guide the client inside if you're operating as a therapist from your own parts. You want to make sure that you're recognizing your own parts and that you're able to have them step back so that you're leading the client from your own self as the therapist. So assessment in IFS, one thing is you want to, as they present their problem and they're listing off maybe some symptoms that they may have, you kind of want to explore and see if that system is more of a protector or an exile. And so the easiest way to do that would be to just ask the part. And so you may just say, what do you do for, and insert the client's name. And so that way you're able to realize if that part has a job or not. And so if that part has a job, it's going to be more of a protector. And so it's more likely to be a manager or a firefighter. And then if that part doesn't have a job, it's going to be an exile. And so that's important to kind of know which part is who, because as we move more on into the treatment, you're going to want to work with the managers before you work with the exiles. And so next in assessment, you want to assess how much access the client has to self. And so as you're speaking with the client, you want to pick up and notice if the client is speaking for parts rather than from the parts. And so again, you go back to those 8 C's to see if you're picking up on any of that, to know like how much access does the client have to self? Are they showing compassion and a curiosity towards the part that's coming up? So when using the IFS model, you do want to introduce parts language to the client. And so when they're presenting their problem to you, you can do that by just reframing what they're telling you and reflect that back using parts language. And so then you want to move into the assessment, which we just went over, in recognizing if we're dealing with either a manager or an exile. Because again, you want to work with the managers before the exile. So if you do have an exile, you really just want to acknowledge the exile and just ask if it would be okay for you to work with a manager part first. And you wouldn't necessarily language it that way, but you could pick out a different part and target that part that you know is a manager instead of an exile. And then as you're doing IFS, you always want to get permission. So as you're targeting a part, which pretty much just means to focus on that part and get to know that one specific part better, while the other parts kind of step back, you want to get permission. And so if you're noticing that a client is angry, you get permission of like, is it okay if we focus on that angry part for a little bit? And so you allow the client to say if that's okay or not, and proceed that way. So in doing IFS, this is pretty helpful. So we have our 6 F's to working with protectors, but then we also have our process once we start working with the exiles to unburden the exiles. And so when you are working with your managers or a protector, so manager or firefighter, you do want to just have the client find that part. And so that's going to just be them being able to acknowledge the presence of that part there. Then you'll move on to focus. And so you'll want to have the client focus on that part. And they'll usually sense like a stronger energy from that part. And then as we move on to flesh out, you want the client to be able to recognize where they're noticing that part in or around their body. And so usually they can do all of that sometimes simultaneously, where you can find focus and flesh it out all instantaneously. And then we're going to move into field tours. So you ask the client questions around like, how do you feel towards that part? And so their response to this is really going to let you know if they are responding from another part or if they're actually responding for self. And so that's where being really familiar with the HCs is going to be helpful, because if they're not having any of those HCs pop up, it's most likely that they're responding out of another part. And if they are responding from another part, there is a technique in IFS used called stepping back. And so you just want to ask that part if it will step back so that you can continue to focus and target on that part that you're working with. So as you move towards continue on with the F's, you want to befriend that part and let them know that you appreciate what they're doing for the system. And then that moves on into fears of really getting to know that part and what they're afraid of and what role they're trying to fill in that system. And then we move on to burdening the exiles. And so this is going to start with witnessing. And so that's pretty much when you're going to have the self that is alongside with the exile, and the exile is really going to kind of explain their story and how they formed, and the self is going to witness that exile's experience. And so then it moves on to reparent, and that's where the self is going to go with the exile back to that past experience, and then the self will be able to give that exile what it needed in that moment that it didn't get, that caused them to go into this exile part. And then we move on to retrieve. And so the exile is going to be able to, um, the self retrieves the exile from that space and kind of put them into a comfortable, safe space. And then they'll move on to unburdening, where the exile can move out of its role and kind of decide what part or role that it wants to move in that will still be helpful to the system, but not as extreme. And then the self helps the integration of the exile moving into that role, and then the managers no longer needing to play their role. And so they can move into more productive roles as well that aren't as burdening for them. So here we have our interventions. And so the first one is the ecological map. So this will just be diagramming. So it can be an illustration of the inner family, and that can be done, just using, a whiteboard, or I've seen this maybe like done through sand tray, where they can use the miniatures to kind of illustrate their parts and how they work together. Next, we have naming, which is really just allowing the client to have a say-so in how they label their parts, and really giving them a name and a voice. And if it's more of a negative label, then there's some renaming that gets done, and making sure that it's not getting named from a part that maybe is polarized with it. And so we don't want any of the parts to feel attacked in that process. And then next we have trailheads, which is really just the focusing on, an emotion, an image, a voice, a sensation, an impulse that's going to help you lead you to a part, so that you can get to know their role, and hopefully, befriended and get to know their fear so that they can become unburdened. Next, we have the room technique. And so this is just going to be putting a part in a comfortable room. So when you're trying to trailhead a part and you just want to focus on one part, sometimes other parts will come up. And so you can always have them step back. But if they're not willing to step back, this is where the room technique comes in, where you can offer them a comfortable room that they would like to go into until you're able to get back to them, to get to know them and learn who they are. And then we have direct access. So this is just going to be when the therapist self is speaking with the client's part. And this is usually done when the client doesn't have much access to self, to be able to have that dialogue with client self and the client's part. When that self is there, then we move into insight, where the client self can then speak with its own parts. So then we have parts language, and that's really just kind of introducing the concept of parts to clients and letting them know that it's kind of separate from their self. And so, when you say a part of me is angry, that kind of feels different than when you say I am angry. And just know that that's not the only thing that the client has to offer. And so that's only a part of them. And so that helps be able to access their self, when you can use that parts language to differentiate some of these parts that are in extreme roles from the self. And then we have our 2-chair technique, which I've also seen this listed as like the empty chair technique. And pretty much that's just where a client sits in front of an empty chair, and they can pretty much speak to a part as if they're filling that empty chair. And then that allows space for the client to allow that part to respond from that empty chair. And then we have hypothetical questions, and that's going to be, for example, if you weren't filling this role, what is something that you would like to do? And so that allows parts to start thinking, like, in the future, of not having to be in this extreme role and putting some trust into the self. And then we have conference table, and that is when you have a specific problem, the self, when there's enough access to self, the client gets all of the parts that are involved in the problem and allow them to kind of sit at a conference table and talk about the problem as the self is kind of refereeing and making sure that all the parts are being respectful to each other. And that helps the parts build trust in the self as well, as it gives them a chance to be heard, but it also gives the self ability to be in charge and be the leader and make the final decision. And so here we have some resources. So I'll go ahead and go through some of those. So here we have the official IFS website. It's the ifsinstitute.com. And here there's a lot of information you can find. The first thing I want to point out is if you want to find an IFS therapist, you can have look for that online where you can find a professional, and that'll basically list anyone that has gone through official IFS training, level 1, 2, or 3. So you are able to find that training here. It's usually booked up, but there is other online training that you can access on demand. There's also other resources. I want to pull up the articles because there is a pretty cool article, if I can find it, which is the internal family systems model outline. And so this is really helpful because this gives off some basic assumptions of the model as well. Here you can see some of the goals in which we talked about, some information on parts, the self, a breakdown of the parts, like we've already discussed, and then some more information for beginning to use the model and working with individual, but also family members. So here's some information around working with individuals. And so we kind of talked about some of the interventions, but here are some additional ones listed that we didn't necessarily go over. They can help you access parts and kind of get some insight or some access to self. And so they separate that through non-imaging techniques and then imaging, which is more so going to be going inside. And I've seen this more so during like guided meditations where these exercises have been done. But here's some more information as far as working with families, and then some common mistakes in the strengths of the model. Another resource I want to point out is the IFS growth programs. And so there's going to be more information on this website. Actually, I'm going to go back because I did want to point out the IFS store. And I just wanted to point this out because this has all of the IFS resources, even if it wasn't written by Richard Schwartz, who came up with IFS. So this is just all the IFS books, parts books, everything. And so that's available too. Going back to the IFS growth program, so there's plenty of information on here as well. There's going to be some training, some classes. There's books. There was a workbook on here that used to be like a free PDF. I didn't see it on here anymore, but I do have a copy that I'm happy to share that with anyone, of some worksheets that basically just had IFS exercises on them. And then the next resource I'd like to share with you all, this is from Insight Timer, and this is a meditation website. And so this has Richard Schwartz's collection of his guided meditations of accessing parts and getting to know them. And so this will be more so useful for individuals that want to access and get to know parts by themselves if they don't necessarily have a therapist to see that would practice this. And so these are just guided meditations that you're able to listen to and go into your own meditation and kind of connect with your parts. The next resource here is YouTube. There's plenty of IFS videos that you can find on YouTube, but I did specifically want to point out this IFSCA YouTube page that is, I believe his name is Derek Scott. This is just his page where he is certified as an IFS therapist. And so he has some pretty cool videos and playlists that he offers that will be helpful in learning more information about IFS. And then lastly, there are some podcasts that are specific to IFS. But then, of course, there's other podcasts that maybe are more broad and we'll just have an episode here or there that are IFS, which those are usually easy to search if you just go to your podcast. I do it from my iPhone, but if I search IFS, that usually gives me every IFS podcast. But these are specific podcasts that are IFS specific for all episodes, not just onesie twosies. But if you look at the IFS website, he does also have podcasts that he has that are specific to IFS, but maybe the whole podcast channel isn't IFS. It may just be a therapy podcast. And then I'm going to stop sharing. As far as references, I just took all this information from the Internal Family Systems Therapy book, the second edition. But I'm going to stop sharing because I did want to share. I made the purchase of buying parts cards. And so these are pretty cool. They were $20, and then I paid an extra $7 to actually get them in protectors. But this is just pretty much going to help clients have a visual of maybe what their parts are. If they're having a hard time maybe naming it or identifying with it, these are some cards that will kind of help them give words to their experiences. And so this is something that I've been using in session, and it's pretty cool because if you go to interactivecards.com, I believe it is, they will have more information about these cards and about some techniques that they use with them. And so I just wanted to share these. These are my personal cards, but they're pretty cool, and I'm not against anybody borrowing them. But I have used these in sessions of just allowing these cards to kind of help the client with words that maybe they're not able to kind of formulate on their own. So that's all I got for the training today. By all means, I'm not an IFS expert. I'm really just trying to learn more about the theory. And so I thought, the information that I found, that it would be great to share that with others. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to be a resource. And then of course, if you all have more IFS information that you have that you'd like to share, by all means do share those things with me. I'd be interested to have that conversation. And then have a great day.